Welcome to the Friday edition of Juan's World. And today, in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, I thought it might be interesting to talk a little bit about viruses, what they are, and so forth. And in particular, I got interested in the question of whether viruses are living things. I was having a conversation with some friends on Zoom last week, and that topic came up. And the scientists in the group seemed to say, yeah, it's pretty much agreed that viruses are not living things. Which is a little bit startling in a way, because they certainly feel like living things. They feel like they're close to bacteria. You know, bacteria are living things. They're cells, they're organisms. They infect us and make us sick. And so do viruses, and viruses replicate and look an awful lot like living things, and yet historically biologists have said no, they are not living things. And that was the old consensus that my friends were touting. Well, the fact of the matter is that biologists don't agree. Some people think they are living things, probably the majority, but there's a growing minority that say they are living things. So that leads to a general question of what is a living thing? What is life? I know that's actually more of a philosophical question than a biological question, but it's an important question. So let's consider that question in the context of viruses, and let's get down that rabbit hole. Now, the easiest place to start is to look at what a virus is. A virus is basically some genetic material encased in protein. It's not a cell. Can't consider it to be a cellular organism. It's just genetic material, which could be DNA, but more commonly RNA and some protein, and that's it. And the genetic material is what replicates. And viruses do not have a metabolism because they are not cellular, and so they have to reside in a host, and they have to get the necessary materials to replicate from host cells. And that of course is why they're a problem, because they invade host cells and they take stuff from the cells, and that, being very simplistic of course, makes you sick, because they're taking stuff that you need and they're replicating. So they don't have a metabolism, but they do replicate, and they are made of biological materials. They're made of DNA or RNA and protein. So why aren't they living? Well, that's the key question. But let me sidestep that for a moment and just talk about a few other important basic things. One of the key things that viruses do that living things do is that they evolve. They evolve according to the basic principles of natural selection. And the mechanism is pretty much the same as the evolution of what we know of as living things. That is, a virus can only survive within a host, but there comes a point where there aren't enough hosts. And there are two reasons why there are not enough hosts. One of them is that the population has become immune. Now, people become immune to viruses in several different ways, but the basic one is that the virus invades the body and the immune system of the body is alerted and starts producing antibodies that are specific to the virus. That's one of the amazing things about the body, is that it understands the structure of the virus and puts out antibodies that can combat the virus. And when you've got enough people in a population that are immune, the virus cannot continue because it can't replicate in hosts. Now, if we consider the virus not to be a living thing, then we can't say that if everybody is immune, the virus dies. But we can say that the virus becomes dormant, effectively doesn't exist in any capacity in the living world. The other thing that can cause a loss of hosts for the virus is if the virus kills everybody. Now, that's not a very efficient virus. A virus that is so fatal that anyone who catches it dies means that the virus no longer has any hosts. So, for both of those reasons, viruses have to evolve. And they evolve in two ways. They evolve, one of the ways in which they evolve is to change enough so that the antibodies that the immune population has produced are not effective against the new strain. And the other way that they can evolve is to be less fatal. That is, to make people sick enough so that they continue to be hosts and they continue to spread the virus. Very important. If the host dies, that host no longer can spread the virus to other people. But if the people just get sick, then they can be contagious for other people around them and the virus spreads happily. So, if things can replicate and they can evolve by natural selection, then that's one of the ways that we can consider them to be living things. Now, viruses are very small. They can't be seen with any power of an optical microscope. You have to use an electron scanning microscope because they are so small. But they've been studied for a very long time, and cures for viruses have been around a lot longer than cures for bacterial diseases. Edward Jenner, who is considered to be the founder of vaccination in the late 18th and early 19th century, noticed that smallpox, which was quite rampant in his day, didn't spread among workers, particularly women, who milked cows. That seems like an odd correlation, but this was because cows were contagious with cowpox, and the dairymaids and people who milked cows usually got cowpox. And for just, I guess, dumb luck reasons, the cowpox antibodies that were produced in these workers were also antibodies against smallpox. And cowpox is a relatively mild disease, and so that people who milked cows would get cowpox and then would be immune to smallpox. And so Jenner made the amazing conclusion that if he infected people deliberately with cowpox, they would be immune to smallpox. And he was right. And obviously things have developed a lot since then, but that's still the basic mechanism. And back when I was a boy, everyone who traveled had to be vaccinated against smallpox. We used to carry a vaccination certificate in our passports. And I have a nice little round scar on my upper arm, as do just about everybody my age who traveled, from my smallpox vaccination. But here, the thing about vaccines is that they are specific to one virus. Antibiotics are not like that. Antibiotics didn't come along until the 20th century with penicillin. And penicillin was kind of a wonder drug because it seemed to be able to kill just about every bacterium that roamed the earth. And there are still what they call broad spectrum antibiotics that just kind of do a number on whatever bacterium is knocking around. Although things are changing there too. But with viruses, you have to have a specific vaccination for a specific virus. And when I was a kid, there were no vaccines for measles or mumps or rubella. There was a vaccine for polio. I got vaccinated as an infant for polio. But every winter I got one of the, what they called childhood diseases. I got mumps, measles, chickenpox, rubella, and thought nothing of it. There was always 1 or 2 weeks in the year when I was out sick with something. Well, now they have vaccines for them. But you have to develop a particular vaccine for a particular virus. And if the virus mutates enough, the antibodies that you have produced before will not be effective against it next time around, which is why influenza is common worldwide, because it mutates every year. So every year you have to get a different vaccine. And of course we don't have a vaccine for the common cold. And probably if we did, we'd also have to do the same thing year in, year out. I'm not sure why there isn't a great emphasis on vaccinating against the cold. I think it's probably because it's not serious enough. Vaccinating against influenza is serious enough because people who have comorbidities, people who are older or who have underlying problems like heart disease and diabetes and so forth, could die. And that's the thing about viruses, is they may not be like totally fatal, but they can certainly be fatal for a percentage of the population, which is the case with COVID-19. It's not especially fatal, but it's fatal enough that getting a vaccine is really important. So let's get back to the question of whether viruses are living things or not. Now we know of other things that are clearly not living that can do the things that viruses do, and I'm thinking particularly of the aptly named computer viruses. Computer viruses are contagious. They can spread from computer to computer, but they need a host. They need a computer, and they need a computer that has code in it that they can feed off, just like a virus feeds off the human body. A computer virus feeds off the code in a computer, and it can replicate itself. So in pretty much most respects, a computer virus is like a pathogenic virus. It's not a living thing. I mean, we can get rid of a computer virus. We can't say we've killed it. But we can say we've got rid of it. In the same way that eventually the WHO got rid of smallpox. Smallpox does not exist anymore because enough people were vaccinated or died that the smallpox virus had nowhere to go. And so it doesn't exist anymore, except in small quantities in laboratories around the world, just in case it reappears. And there are, I guess, sort of semi-possible scenarios. There was an episode of House MD in which some deep-sea divers pulled up some treasure and broke a bottle, and they got sick, and the sickness, it turns out, was smallpox because it was in the bottle. Well, I don't know enough about medicine to know whether that's possible or not. But basically speaking, because the world became at one time more or less immune to smallpox, it had nowhere to go. Did it die? If a computer virus has nowhere to go, can we say it's died? Well, I don't think so, because it never was a living thing. But the difference between computer viruses and pathogenic viruses is that the pathogenic viruses are biological entities. They're made up of various protein chains and chains of genetic material and so forth. What makes them living or not? Can we say that because they don't have their own metabolism they're not living, or because they're not cellular they're not living? Well, this is really not so much a biological question as a philosophical question. And in the grand scheme of things, it's one of those questions that really doesn't matter. Whether a virus is living or not is irrelevant to the fact that if you get it, it will make you sick. Now, one of the things that this discussion about whether viruses are living things or not leads to is the question of how did life begin in the first place? And there's a certain amount of knowledge about how strings of amino acids can develop under different conditions depending on the nature of the atmosphere and the temperature and so on and so forth. A lot of that's been investigated, and it is possible to produce long organic strings in the laboratory that are, equivalent to amino acids that are the basic building block of proteins. And you can kind of see how at some point long strings of organic compounds can form spontaneously and can link together and so forth. When do they become living? How does that happen? That's still an open question in biology. Is that when does a bunch of organic compounds in long chains form enough long chains and enough complexity that they become living? And it seems to me that viruses are an interesting natural laboratory for answering that question. And again, you may say, well, who cares? Why does it matter? Well, in a way it matters, because at some point or other, a lot of people, when they've got nothing better to do, ask questions like, what is the meaning of life? Which personally I find to be a totally uninteresting question. But they're essentially saying, like, why am I here? How did this happen? What is my purpose? And one way to answer that is to look at the beginnings of life. And of course there are different possibilities. You know, if you're an Orthodox Jew or an evangelical Christian, then you may believe that God did it, which answers one question, but it still leaves a lot of questions open. That is, you can say, well, you know, God created life, and I'm here because God's here, so in some ways I have to have a relationship with God, and that provides purpose. Well, okay, but then the question is always where God came from, and the answer is usually, well, He's always been here. I don't find that a particularly satisfying answer, because I don't find the concept of infinity, whether you move it infinitely back into the past or infinitely forward into the future, it doesn't make it doesn't sit well with me intellectually, any more than the idea of infinite space. And we know that the universe is not infinite, it doesn't go on forever, or at least that's the current consensus. But that also leaves this horrible thought, well, is there something outside the universe? You know, if you go back to the Big Bang, for example, instead of God, instead of suggesting that God made everything, you say, well, it was some kind of spontaneous expansion of a singularity, and it's been expanding outwards ever since. And once it was very, very hot, and then it cooled down, and blah, and so on and so forth. Still doesn't answer the question of where life comes from, and more importantly, it doesn't answer the question of why are we here, except to say, well, it's an accident. So those are some of your choices. You can say that something created us, created life, or we're just dumb luck. It doesn't help fully in answering the question of what am I as an individual supposed to do on a day-to-day basis. Well, I mean, you've got Christian theology, and you've or Jewish theology, or Muslim theology, Hindu, Buddhist, Jainist, whatever. I mean, you've got lots of complicated ways of thinking about these things. But for me, I want to know how I am supposed to live my life in a way that is, I don't know, meaningful perhaps, or satisfying. Like what should I do? And you know, the origins of life, the creation stories, or any of those other narratives don't help me right here, right now. I need something else, and I'm going to be infuriating as always and say I'm not going to answer that question today, but I'll try to answer it at some point. And meanwhile, please tell your friends if you like my videos, please like, please subscribe, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to have a carnival recipe for you on Tuesday, so I'll see you then.